Hello everyone, welcome back to the Laserdisc series. My name is Adam, and in today's video we're going to be talking about the different types of audio that were on the Laserdisc format. I'm going to be talking about the evolution of the audio that was available on the Laserdiscs over the years, from its in conception to its death. We're going to be talking about the different types of cables that were used, the outputs and the plug-ups to either current setups or a setup maybe that you've got that is slightly older. We're going to go through the best calibration of those devices, the best placement if you want a full cinema setup, and the best sort of wires, I guess, to use, and the best practices to do to get the best experience. For me, audio is 50% of the film, so there's a lot there to get right and there's a lot there to get wrong to not fully take advantage of the audio experience of Laserdisc. The audio side of Laserdisc is actually quite a complicated thing, so you'll have to bear with me here. And for both NTSC and for PAL, they're quite different because they handled the Laserdisc format very differently. They had different capabilities and there were different choices made. And so you'll find a lot more audio features perhaps in the NTSC discs than there were on the PAL discs. The PAL system, which was the UK and most of Europe, they employed a 5 megahertz bandwidth of signal scored onto the Laserdisc. So within that 5 megahertz, that contained all the picture and sound information, whereas the NTSC system, which was USA and Japan, had 6 megahertz of bandwidth to put all their audio and video information on. So there was a lot more room on the NTSC discs, and they took advantage of that. Now, when Laserdisc first came out in 1978, there was only one option, and that was mono. It was an analog form which was sampled at 44.1 kilohertz per second and 16 bits, basically a CD sound, but it was an analog, uncompressed mono track. And if you wanted to hear it, you'd need an RCA jack like this, and you'd plug this up to your Laserdisc player and your TV, which basically were also mono, and you could hear the full fidelity of that mono track, which was such a shame because Jaws being heard in mono is a crime of cinema. Now, before we get into the different formats and how they evolved, I want to talk about the differences between the PAL and the NTSC audio formats. So the NTSC Laserdiscs contained a different combination of soundtracks. They were either one of the following, but never contained all. So you either had 2 mono analog tracks, which were separated, not a stereo field, but a separate 2-track mono, or it had 1 stereo track. So it was just a left and a right, but it could either be 2 mono tracks or 1 stereo track. Or they would have 2 mono analog tracks and 2 mono PCM tracks, which could be used as a single stereo track. Another variation would be 1 stereo analog track and then 2 mono PCM tracks. And when I say PCM, they're pulse code modulated tracks, digital, okay, just like a CD. Another combination could be 2 stereo analog tracks and 1 stereo PCM track. And then eventually you'd get AC3 Dolby Digital, which would always sit in the analog track. It would take over one of the tracks, and so therefore you could have another single mono analog track and then maybe 1 stereo digital track. And then eventually DTS came out, and then that took over the digital track, meaning you could have 1 stereo analog track. So basically in America they seem to always employ the 2-track system, either 2 analog and then it would be 2 analog and 2 digital, or it would be 4 and it could be a mixture of various different stereo or mono combinations depending on what they were putting on that disc. But over in PAL land it was a little bit different. They didn't have the bandwidth available to be able to put all these tracks on. So at the beginning we had a mono track, but then obviously in 1982 stereo came out, and so both, you know, employed the stereo version. And if you wanted to plug it up, you would need two RCA cables, a left and a right, to get that stereo sound, for which they were both singly mono channels effectively, but one would be dedicated left, dedicated right. So in PAL land they had two analog tracks on what was Laservision then, and or they could, when Dolby Digital came out, they could employ one stereo track, or they would have the one stereo analog on Laservision, which would still employ the two RCA jack system. Eventually Dolby Digital would come out, and for that you would actually need a different cable. Dolby Digital did not go over the analog RCA jacks until DTS, but you would need a coaxial or optical, or however you want to call it. This is a optical toslink, and it would plug into the back of your Laserdisc player to allow you to access the Dolby Digital tracks. You could use, if your player supports it, a coaxial cable, but this was reserved more for uncompressed 6-channel sound, but it could also be used for Dolby Digital up to 7.1, which would then be zipped up into a single stream bitrate or bit stream and sent out to your receiver or TV, which would then decode it and unpack it into, you know, the 6 channels. So when digital came out, you could have two mono digital channels on the PAL versions, or you could have one stereo digital channel. And of course when DTS came out, I think there was only one ever title released in PAL land on DTS, because it would take over the digital track. So it would be you know, the only digital track left, because as soon as digital came out, PAL switched their 2 tracks, because that's all they ever had, from analog straight to digital, with no more analog tracks on there. So if I go to my PAL Laserdisc of Star Wars, the special edition, it says on the back that it's Dolby Surround. So this would have been a Dolby Digital Surround track. I'll explain what all that means later on, but this would not have the analog version of the Dolby Surround. It would have the Dolby Digital version of the Dolby Surround. But over in NTS land, here is a film sort of the similar time. This actually states that it has Dolby Surround and an AC3 digital. Now, AC3 digital tracks tended to be placed on one of the analog tracks in America. So it would be a single mono track, and it would be a zipped up bit stream of 6 channels that needed to be unzipped upon play. So the Dolby, where it says on here Dolby Surround, this most likely would be a Dolby Digital Surround track with the AC3 digital on one of the mono channels, leaving another mono channel open for a commentary, which I don't see that this holds. So I don't really know what they did with the other mono channel. Probably nothing, because it didn't ever really need to be used. So if it wasn't, it just wasn't put on. So those are all the various different tracks that were available on both NTSC and PAL. You had only ever 2 channels of audio on PAL discs, but you had up to 4 channels available to you on NTSC discs, and they would be in various combinations of either using a mono, stereo, maybe 2 monos, or 1 stereo, or just whatever combination there was. So let's talk about those different formats now. So we've had the mono, and now we've had the stereo, and this would become available both in analog and digital, Dolby Digital. So to play a Dolby Digital track, you would need the optical toslink connection. This will play a Dolby Digital track up to 5.1 nicely. Another cable that you would need is that coaxial big bad boy cable, quite thick, and this would play either compressed or uncompressed. On the optical toslink, it was always compressed. It was always a compressed cable. This doesn't do uncompressed. So I've just dropped my cable. So if you only have on the back of your Laserdisc player 2 of the RCA jacks, then you only have access to either the analog tracks that are on there, or a AC3 Dolby Digital track that you will need to demodulate at the other end for it to play or unzip it in 6-channel surround. If you only have these 2 cables plus this, you only have access to the analog tracks, the AC3 digital tracks, or any Dolby Digital track on there. Basically, you've got the full breadth of whatever you want to employ there. If you have, and some players had this other options, most probably didn't, if you have this on the coaxial, you basically can play any audio track you want. You won't have access to the analog tracks because they were only fed through these RCA cables, but any digital track or DTS track will play through this. The AC3 digital will also play through this if you hook it up to an AC3 digital amp or a demodulator. So we'll talk about that in a second. So basically, they're the cables you're going to need if you want to take advantage of the audio capabilities from a Laserdisc. So what are the different formats? Well, like I said, in 1982 we had stereo. Regardless if it's analog or digital now, there was stereo, a left and a right channel, and that was it. The film soundtrack would be encoded down to a left and a right channel, and that is it. But soon after, in like 1984 to 1986, after Return of the Jedi, came into the market what was known as Pro Logic. And this was a very basic form of theatre surround, because obviously in the theatre you've got 6 channels dedicated on the magnetic tape of 35mm, and so you can therefore play up to, you know, dedicated 6 channels. And obviously all the cinemas were becoming THX certified so they could play Return of the Jedi in the best possible way, and to translate that down into a 2-channel analog system, there was some little digitary pokery that needed to go on. So what would happen is, if you're sitting in your living room and you've got your left and your right, and you've got your center here, and you've got a left and a right surround behind you, the sound would still be coming out from your Laserdisc player in stereo, but within that stereo field would be a matrixed surround Pro Logic that could take advantage of all your various different speakers. You would need a amplifier to take that stereo sound and decode it into a Pro Logic setup. And what it basically meant was, within the stereo track there would be some in phase and some out of phase material. The out of phase, well, that would sound like, would be fed to your surround, and in them days it was just a mono single feed out to 2 channels. So you would have a left and a right surround channel, but it would only be a mono track that was really being sent out within this stereo setup. So it would be the same signal coming out both speakers to give an illusion of surround, enveloping surround. And within the in-phase material of your stereo track, which sounded like, it basically would have the left and the right for your front left and right, and then a phantom center to be coming out of, through your receiver, the center speaker. So you would have all your dialogue and some incidental stuff coming out of your center speaker, and then the main lower frequencies would be coming out of your left and your right. And this would give the illusion of theatre surround, and it was really quite revolutionary at the time. Now this could still happen on VHS as well. This wasn't limited to just Laserdisc. So if you have a title, and sometimes they would put Pro Logic or sometimes they would put Dolby Surround, don't be confused that they mean the same thing, because they don't. Dolby Surround and Dolby Pro Logic are 2 different ways of formatting sound within a stereo field. So eventually, I would say the late 80s, 89, 90, Dolby Surround came into it. This was digital, but you could find it on the analog tracks as well. And basically what this did is, instead of matrixing a single mono surround, it would be able to matrix two stereo separate surrounds for your left and right. The trade-off is that it would still retain the front and left fronts, but the center channel was not now a discrete center channel. It was just kind of picking up the frequencies where the dialogue would be there, on the in-phase material only. But now we had a two out-phase left and right dedicated channel. So it was a 4.0 system basically, compared to the 3.0 Pro Logic system. You could have, you know, sweeping surround enveloping you rather than just going, you know, through you or over, you know, depending on where your speakers were placed. It was an improvement, but it still used that stereo track, that stereo field, to matrix in using a dedicated receiver. Your TV wouldn't be able to play this. If you plugged it up and used the Dolby Surround or Dolby Pro Logic track, it would just play in stereo out your TV, and it would just sound like a stereo track. The same as if your receiver was set to the stereo mode, you would only hear it playing out your front and left speakers. It was only when you employed the circuitry for Pro Logic or Surround on your receiver that it would activate this magic and honestly really be enveloping. But all of the material that was being shot out to your rears were only discrete audio. It wasn't a dedicated audio system, which is very different to the next version of audio that came out, I think in 1997. The first film, in fact, that used the AC3 Dolby Digital track was Clear and Present Danger. And it was truly a groundbreaking, thunder rumbling system that was employed. It basically in America took over one of the analog channels as a zipped up audio file of 6 channels that would then need to be unzipped into a 6-channel dedicated surround field for your front left, front right, or front left, front right for you, center and left and right surrounds, and a 0.1 sub as well. And it was really, really good. It actually truly did replicate now the theater experience of having 6 dedicated channels, which the theaters had for over 2 decades now, in the home. And so after 1997, I think it was, you were truly, actually it might have been 95, I think that came out, but you would have been truly getting a true theater experience. So after AC3 Dolby Digital, the next incarnation was DTS, the Digital Theater System. Now, DTS employed the digital tracks only. It never touched the analog tracks, which meant on a PAL system that completely nuked the audio, because it only had 2 channels, you know, a Dolby Digital stereo. So a DTS going on the only track available meant that no other track could go on there. And I think only one title came out in PAL land on DTS, but in America there were loads of DTS titles, because you had your 2 stereo or 2 mono, you had your 1 stereo or 2 mono analog tracks, but you also had your 2 mono or 1 stereo digital tracks. And because DTS would take up the DTS digital, it left the analogs to put anything else on. And I don't know if they really did employ director's commentaries on these DTS discs. I think maybe they might have, but it might have just been a stereo analog available as well for those that perhaps didn't have the DTS, because otherwise if you didn't have a DTS receiver you wouldn't be able to hear anything on the PAL one. So the DTS was really, really groundbreaking. It came a bit late to Laserdisc, to be honest, but it was much better, only slightly, than the Dolby Digital. It employed like a 1200 kilobit rate, whereas the Dolby Digital was only 384, I believe, But the analog tracks, which were uncompressed, actually had a bitrate over 700, which was actually better than the Dolby Digital AC3 track. Now, you might think it's better, but remember, it was only in stereo or Dolby Surround or Dolby Pro Logic, whereas AC3 were all dedicated. But if you look at the technical aspects of it, the bitrate on the analog tracks were 700 kilobytes per second, but on the Dolby Digital it was only like 384, I think. So it didn't really, and which actually was higher than the cinema at the time. They only employed 320 kilobits per second. DVD, I think, had some titles that went higher. Blu-ray obviously now started pumping out uncompressed Dolby tracks, and Blu-ray you had the uncompressed Atmos as well was on there, which is compressed, I believe. It really depends on what sound setup you've got, though, to take advantage of any of what I'm talking about. If you've only got a TV, and on the back of your TV you may have the two RCA analog jacks if you're lucky, but most likely you're only probably going to have a HDMI cable and a Toslink. Now obviously HDMI doesn't exist in Laserdisc land, so if your receiver has HDMI output, that means you can pump out both audio and video from your receiver to your TV. And if you plug your Laserdisc player up to your receiver, it will then take that audio via the HDMI cable. Now, HDMI cable supports both compressed and uncompressed channels up to 7.1 surround in either analog or digital. So HDMI was really the motherlode of audio. You only ever needed a HDMI cable. And so receivers, after like 2001, I think, stopped putting out the circuitry for the Laserdisc demodulation of AC3 and just started to put a HDMI on there, because after 2001 they weren't making any discs, Laserdisc was dying off, and you could do everything through a HDMI. And as that was becoming the standard on the TVs as well, you don't really need all these other connections as well. So we don't need to put in the system a demodulation system. So what I'm trying to say is, if you've got a audio receiver up until about 1997, then you can actually listen to the AC3 Dolby Digital tracks that are on the analog zipped up file without the need of a demodulator. You can just hook up straight away the Dolby, the digital Toslink cable, the optical one, straight into your receiver, and it will output and unzip the file into 6 channels of beautiful surround. But if you've bought your receiver in like the last 10 years, you probably don't have that circuitry on board your receiver anymore, which means if you do try and listen to it, it's going to sound really bad. So what you're going to need is a demodulator box, which is basically the circuitry from within those receivers back in the day in its own little separate box. So you'll plug your Laserdisc player up to that, and then that will go into your receiver, and it will unzip the zipped up file and send the 6 channels to your receiver, and then you can listen to the AC3 track. And honestly, the AC3 track on Laserdisc was really good, but I would say a uncompressed audio format is much better than a compressed audio format. There's more errors in a compressed, during the unzipping phase than there is where it's already uncompressed. It's a higher bitrate generally in the uncompressed stage than it is in the compressed stage. So I tend to love to listen to the uncompressed audio where I can, which means I would favor the analog tracks over a digital. But obviously with my PAL Laserdisc of Star Wars here, it's only got Dolby Surround digital, so I'm going to have to listen to it digitally. But any other Laserdisc where there is analog available as well, I can listen to either a analog stereo for Dolby Surround and Dolby Pro Logic, or I can pump out the digital for dedicated 5.1. Now the benefit to all these NTSC discs is because they retain the two tracks of analog and the 2 tracks of digital is that they could put director's commentaries, isolated musical scores, other features on these tracks other than having the soundtrack as well. But never once did any Laserdisc ever employ the technology of AC3 alongside the DTS. It could though. Like, you could put the DTS on the digital tracks, you could have the AC3 on one of the analog tracks, and then you could have a director's commentary, and not a single Laserdisc offered this. How amazing would it be if you could decide between DTS, Dolby Digital, plus the director's audio commentary? Oh, hang on, that's Blu-ray and 4K. That's exactly what you get on Blu-ray and 4K. It could have happened on Laserdisc. The technology was there, but just no studio did. I think it was down to the old money thing, because to license DTS, to license Dolby, you had to pay for it. And so to license both, where they're both effectively the same soundtrack, one just slightly better, going on in 2 different formats, seemed like a waste of money. It was either one or it was the other. So that's why the DTS logo on the Laserdiscs that you see are very prominent, because they don't carry any Dolby Digital tracks at all. They carry the DTS and an analog stereo track. For those who don't have DTS, why would you buy a DTS disc? Save it for people who do. So how do we set up at home? I've showed you the wires that you need to use, but how do we set it all up? Well, obviously, if you've got your telly, you plug the wires in, you're laughing, you're away there. But if you've got a dedicated receiver, you've got more options available to you. You've most likely got all those plugs that I just showed, and I recommend plugging the analog 2 jacks up, as well as either one or both of the optical and coaxial if you can. If you haven't got both, you just plug up what you do have. Now, in terms of speaker placement, I think it's really important to note this. There is a major difference between having a cinema setup and having a dedicated cinema room. Most people, I think, will have their home cinema setup in their main living room or their main room where they reside, you know, like me. Most other people, small amount, will have a dedicated cinema room that has no other purpose but for a cinema setup. And if you've got that, you can have as many speakers as you want, pad your walls out, blast your music, lovely. But for those who are using their living room or their dedicated living space, you need to take into consideration that you've also got to reside in that space and be comfortable when you're not watching films and not using it as a cinema. So I'd say, you know, Atmos that uses 7.1 speakers is just overkill in this confined environment. And I think, you know, you'd probably do better having a 5.1, but at the end of the day, it's totally up to you what you want to do. Whatever system you have employed, I would highly recommend, if you've got a projector, obviously it's going to go behind you. I recommend having your audio receiver and your Laserdisc player sort of residing in the vicinity. You know, if you've got your telly on, you're using a TV, then you can have your receiver at that end and your Laserdisc as well. But you do not want to be using very long cables. This is the point I'm trying to make, is the reason why you don't want to be using long cables is the longer the cable, the more chance of interference you'll get, you know, on that cable. Some cables, which I don't think this applies to the optical ones, because they send a digital optical signal. I think it really will apply to the coaxial ones, because even though you can send a digital signal alongside this, you can send an uncompressed. It basically has 6 wires wrapped within this to create one. So it's kind of just like a fancy, if I can find it now, it is just like a fancy version of this, but having 6 of these wrapped into the one cable. It's basically what it is. So this is still susceptible to interference just as much as this one. The interference I mean is going to be mainly along the electrical cables that are powering your various devices. If you have electrical cables overlapping your audio cables, the hum of electricity can be picked up in the cable and output as hiss in your device. So you'll think your analog channels will have more hiss. It will also make your digital AC3 track have dropouts, and you'll see the red light on your receiver flashing. You'll be like, it's dropout city here, what's going on? And it's because of the interference along your cables. I do recommend the audio cables to be highlighted on your skirting board or on your wall, away from the electrical cables that could be running along the floor, or have them vice versa to avoid any plug outlets that may reside on that wall. You don't want electrical cables running over your audio cables. So the longer the cable, the more chance this has to happen. Plus, the longer the cable, the more chance of having dropouts as well. Again, we're not talking about the optical one. The optical one is exempt of all of this. So really think about your cabling and your speaker placement. Obviously, if you've got a TV, you're going to have a left and a right speaker, and your center speaker, is going to go either above your TV or below your TV in the center, and your left and right will go respectively on the left and right. If you have unshielded speakers, you do not want placing them next to your TV or your monitor, because the magnetic field that they generate will be seen as ghosting on your screen. You'll be able to see it when you turn your TV on and present a black screen. You'll see this white ghosting effect where you can actually see the magnetic field even on current 4K TVs. Obviously, you turn off your receiver, you may still see this magnetic field. I don't know. But you definitely don't want to have your speakers too close to your TV. You want to have them at quite a distance. But if they are shielded, you can have them right next to it and you won't have this problem. I do recommend magnetically shielded speakers over the non-ones. Also, if you've got floor standing speakers that have very powerful subwoofers, you really don't need a dedicated subwoofer, because the floor standing speakers will handle those bass notes just as well as your subwoofer. Your subwoofer will go lower and you'll get a proper rumble, but if you're in a shared living environment here and not a dedicated cinema, then you really don't need that subwoofer. You're just rumbling the neighbors and your windows for nothing. You're just kind of overdoing it, I feel. But again, this is all totally my opinion. You go do what you feel is right. That is the correct answer here. I'm just perhaps offering what I would do merely as a guide. It's more of a guideline. And then, of course, your surround speakers will sit behind you. Now, I see a lot of people putting them up on the walls, nailing them or drilling platforms for them to sit on. And unless you've got a dedicated cinema with the padding to go with that, I would say that is not a good idea. Not only if you have them higher than your head height, facing outwards, the sound is being wafted above you and you're not actually getting to hear the full effect of that sound. You'll hear the sound, but not as it's fully intended, because it's actually going above you and mixing with the front sound that's coming at you. So if a helicopter was to go, you know, towards you in the camera and behind you in the film, you would still perceive the audio of that helicopter when it's gone behind you to be in front of you, and you'd be like, that's a bit shit, isn't it? Whereas if you have your speakers down just literally where your head is, when you're sitting down and you've got the top of your head, and you put your speakers on your left and right either side facing each other, you will have the full impact of that helicopter going over. Basically, what you want to try and do is replicate this with the surround speakers. You want to have the speakers facing each other, not facing out, because again, even if they're at head height and they're facing out, the sound is being pushed to the front and you'll still get that same effect. You need to have them facing each other at your head height to get that full enveloping surround sound. Also, if you have them on a wall, either a floating frame or drilled into the wall, you're going to get vibrations, and the vibrations that rattle through the metal joins of the platform or even the wall itself can actually sound like rumble, crackly, like you'll hear it in the sound, and it won't be actually part of the soundtrack. It'll be a side effect of how you've set it up. So having them on platforms like either side of your listening position is always the best way. Obviously, you've got to do this incorporated into your actual living environment. So, you know, but I would definitely recommend these little shelf standing side speakers as your platforms, and have them, you know, the left and the right. Calibrating your sound system is crucial, I feel. Some subwoofers, if you've got a dedicated subwoofer, have a crossover frequency dial that you can actually turn, you know, and it will tell your receiver what signals it can send to that subwoofer. I see a lot of people using 150 and 200 to get that real deep rumble, and it's like you're restricting your subwoofer by doing that. 80 to 85 is the best frequency for crossover. It's the THX standard certified. So if you have a subwoofer and you dial it to 80 or 85, you're telling your receiver that any signal, well, it's above or it's below, it's however you look at it, but any signal below 85, so 85, 100, 150, 200, will be sent to your subwoofer, and then the remaining ones are sent to your front speakers. You're going to get a nice deep rumble and a nice mixture. Again, if you've got floor standing speakers at the front, you really don't need the subwoofer, because your floor standing speakers have a big enough subwoofer on them themselves that you don't really need that. So you don't really need to worry about a crossover, but you can still dial it in on the circuitry of your amplifier if it allows you to do that. Bass management is crucial, I feel, in the enjoyment of a film. Too much bass and it gets muddy, the soundtrack, and the voices are like, what did he say? And too little and you're not taking full advantage of the sound and it's not hitting the impact. And also too much bass and you could be rumbling your windows. I remember when I first got my dedicated subwoofer and I'd turn it to 200 and the windows were rattling literally when it went off, because there was so much bass being sent, because only the low frequencies were being sent to that subwoofer. And so when it did kick off, it kicked off. But dialing it down to 85 meant other signals were being sent as well that weren't as low bassy. So it was taking up the woofer's ability, as it were, and it was more in line with what you'd actually get at the theater. Because remember, theater space is a lot bigger than your living space, unless you got a dedicated cinema room, and the size of your environment is crucial as well into not only speaker placement but volume level of each speaker. So setting the right volumes for each speaker, I feel, is crucial in getting an even sound level. Okay, so calibrating your sound device, your receiver with your speakers, is super important. A lot of films have different levels of volume, and a lot of speakers have different dynamic ranges, and a lot of receivers also have a lot of differences. And I tend to, for me personally, and I think it's a personal preference based off the receiver that I've had and the way it gets me to calibrate it, is that for me there is a perfect level of volume that the volume dial can be set to, and then you just leave it there, like almost like a reference level. On the receiver I have around the 40 to 45% mark, probably about 40%, there is a 0 reference level, and then anything above goes +1, +10, plus whatever, and anything below goes -1, -5, -10 to whatever. And whenever the test tones are being done, the volume will automatically just go to 0 for reference level, and then you dial in your individual speakers. And because the test tone is quite loud, if you have all your speaker volumes down to 0, I find that on my setup I have to underwhelm the, like, turn down the volume on every individual speaker, some more than others, to get an even level field. Now, I'm not saying that this is what you're going to have to do, but the same process will have to be done. Otherwise, you could have, especially if you've got a mixed speaker configuration where you haven't gotten all your speakers from the same set, you know, some people use a different center or different surrounds to what they have as their mains. Your audio can be all over the place. You could find that you can barely hear the dialogue, or the soundtrack sounds muddy, or just a whole load of issues, basically. So I'm going to take you through a quick and dirty way to quickly calibrate not only every individual speaker, but also your own receiver as well, your main receiver, so you can have the perfect volume set no matter if you're watching, say, Twister, Terminator 2, or Speed, and you've got lots of action, lots of loud sounds, or you're watching like Bridget Jones, or you're watching a film that has low volume almost to it, and you haven't got to continually be tweaking, you know, your volume level. So position yourself in the seat that you usually will sit in to watch films, and if your receiver has a remote, great. If it doesn't, you'll have to get up and go and then come and sit back down. But put your volume level to 40% volume, and if it has built-in test tones, great, you can use them, and then each speaker and go, whoa, if that's too loud. You know, the size of your room really does make a difference, because if you've got a very small, say, living room, bedroom area where you've got your cinema set up, the volume will perceive to be louder, even though on your amplifier it's not. So you might have to dial down the sound, which is probably why I've got to dial down the sound to, like, on one speaker it's down to -10, which is the lowest it can go. Although on the flip side, if you're in like a cinema auditorium and you've got a very large living room or a dedicated cinema space, you might find yourself having to dial up, you know, +1, +2, but basically set all your speaker levels so that these test tones sound the same going all the way around you. And don't forget, the ones to the rear will sound out of phase, which has a different kind of white noise attached to it than the in phase front speakers. And obviously your subwoofer, which we'll get to in a second. It's really important that all the speakers are performing at the very same level, even though the center and the two fronts might be quite different in their dynamic range and what they can produce. You do want the audio level going into each speaker to be the same, because burned on the disc or wherever you're getting your audio from, especially if it's compressed, it has what's called like a normalization for dialogue level, which is usually like ±3 to 5 depending on the disc, and so you definitely don't want your vocals to get lost in the soundtrack where you're going, I can't hear what they're saying, or to be too loud and overpowering, and you're like, man, that explosion didn't seem as loud as it should have, really, which can alter the soundtrack to a film. If your volumes on your speaker levels are all out of whack and not properly calibrated, you can actually find that the film that you're watching will be underwhelming or overwhelming. Oh my god, that's too much bass, you know. And sometimes there are mastering errors on films where they have applied too much of one channel. So the subwoofer now, very important. Oh, also as a side note, the distance that you sit from your speaker is very important. If your receiver allows you to attach like a how far away are you from your speaker, make sure you set that correctly and accurately. Sometimes they do it as like a delay, or they just say in meters or feet. That is very important, because obviously the further you go away from a speaker, the more kind of up the volume needs to be. and on the flip side, the closer you are, then the tone down they get. So subwoofers, now a dedicated subwoofer will have very low frequencies, as you know. Sometimes they'll have a range that they can only produce down to. The low end is usually like 250 decibels in the range, whereas the top end can be depending on how good the quality of that subwoofer is. But if you've got floor standing speakers, you really don't need a dedicated woofer. If you've got a speaker setup where it has 2 or 3 like little woofer tweeter things, when you take your covers off your speakers and you can see 2 or 3 of these black round dots that get bigger, then you really don't need a subwoofer, because these speakers in front of you can actually handle those low tones. And you know, if you go and look at your rear speakers, if they have 2 or 3, you know, woofer or tweeter, you know, black dots on them, they can handle the low notes. So really, you really don't need a subwoofer unless you're looking to have a dedicated cinema space and you dampen your walls, and then you can go crazy with whatever speaker setup you want. But if you do decide to incorporate a dedicated subwoofer, a lot of people say behind the sofa is your best bet to place it. I would just say don't place it near a wall, because if there is a window attached to that wall, it will rattle the glass, and a too loud soundtrack could blow that glass. So the most important thing with a dedicated subwoofer is the crossover frequency point. THX stands that 80 to 85 is that sweet spot of crossover for the low tones to go to the subwoofer, and then the rest will go to the front. And if you've got small bookshelf speakers as your front speaker, then you probably might want to set it to 80, 85, as they might not be able to handle lower tones. Or sorry, you might want to set it to like 100, as they might not be able to handle the lower tones. But if you set it to like 150 or 200 and go, yeah, I'm going to get some big bass, then that's all that subwoofer will produce, is the lowest of low tones that might not be present in all soundtracks. So sometimes your subwoofer will be lying idle, and you'll be going, "That's a bit shit." Whereas if you dial it down to 80 to 85, then most frequencies your subwoofer will handle those low end ones, and it will always have something to do. I think the crossover point isn't really talked about, I see on YouTube or in forums, but it's so crucial for setting the right amount of bass sent to the subwoofer. If you don't send enough to it, it can lie dormant. If you send too much, then you lose from the front. But just setting that sweet spot of 80 to 85 is my personal preference, as is having the volume only set to 40 to 45 if you're crazy percent on the dial. The reason for that is in an analog world we get interference, and interference is usually, like in tape, set at a certain decibel within the soundtrack itself. On vinyl there is a low hum at a certain decibel range as well, in a certain frequency, that can be removed through circuitry very cleanly. Tapists, there is the Dolby B and C noise reduction system, which some people like or don't like, and a lot of films were recorded with Dolby's noise reduction systems built within it. So the reason we say 40% is because anything higher than that, you're amplifying a noise floor. And then obviously the louder that gets, the more obvious audio deficiencies get. So if you don't have any calibration test discs, your receiver doesn't allow you to do test tones, set your volume to 40% and play a film. And if it's way too loud in the fronts, you can turn the individual volume down on the speaker until it ain't rattling your teeth, and then make sure that you adjust the center so you can clearly hear the dialogue in the most action scene you can find, and then setting the rear for when the helicopters go behind you. That's kind of like a quick and dirty way to calibrate your system, and that really gives me an enveloping sound of surround of sound. But basically what I'm trying to say is leveling each speaker sound is crucial for having an even playing field of sound that will then hit you, and you honestly hear that film the way it was almost like meant to be played. If they're all uneven and you're hitting and you're not even hearing half the stuff, you could be like, "Whoa, that soundtrack sounds really muddy." And actually, it's probably not. It's your setup, the way you've got it going. So setting and calibrating your home cinema setup is crucial. Some people would recommend using calibration discs. I don't think you need that. You can use your ears. Some people have better hearing than others. Like, we all humans can hear between the 20 and 20 hertz range, but some people swear they can go higher than human hearing is possible. But depending, like, you might have less of that 20 top end range. You might, you know, Beethoven it down to the lower ends. So just use your own ears, you know, and sit yourself where you're going to sit to watch your movies. Play test tones using the remote or whatever you've got on your panel, and make sure that sound coming out is all level around you, and you know you've got it right. And then listen to a couple of films and different analog or digital tracks. Try them all out, but you'll have fun, basically. So that's how you connect up your Laserdisc player to all your devices. That's the different audio types, the audio formats, the quality that evolved over the time. I can't think of anything else. If there is something I've missed, please let me know, and I'll do either a follow-up video or I'll beg for forgiveness in the comments section. I've done the calibration setup of your home cinema. For me, I really believe that audio is 50% of the experience. So if you get it right, you really enjoy that film. If you get it wrong, you're just like, that's a shit film. You know, it really does affect your experience and thoughts on the film. So, you know, get it right and it'll sound awesome. Anyway, thank you so much for watching this video. And I'll see you in the next one, guys. Take care.